In this video, we're going to focus on components of GDP and introduce some details about how various parts of the economy connect with each other. There are four main types of expenditure on goods and services produced in any economy. The first type is consumption. It's consumption by households usually, or we call it private consumption. There's also investment. The third component is government expenditure. Sometimes government expenditure includes investment by the government or public investment, but it could be also that investment includes both public and private investment. And finally, the fourth component is net exports, exports minus imports. We separate out these different parts of expenditure because they behave differently. They depend on different factors, and we need to understand how each one is determined in order to figure out how GDP as a whole is determined. Of course, one can think about more detailed components. For example, consumption could be consumption on durable goods versus non-durable goods. Or investment could be divided between investment on equipment, on software, on buildings. Government expenditure has its own components. Net export has its own components. One can break down these categories into finer details. However, that will make the model very complicated. Analysis becomes very involved, and therefore we just stick to these broad categories in order to make it easier to understand the main forces at work. Most of the factors that work on different components of consumption are similar to each other, and therefore we're going to focus on consumption as a whole, for example. If in some cases breaking up these categories into finer subcategories is helpful, we're going to discuss it at that juncture. Let's first focus on consumption versus investment. For this purpose, let's go to the model we developed in Module 1. We said that firms produce goods and services, sell it to the households, and households spend their money on those goods and services, which we call consumption or household expenditure, and that goes through the product market. Households buy goods and services in the product market, and the money ends up with the firms. The firms produce goods and services using labor, capital, and other factors of production, and for that they have to pay households. That we called income, and that works through the factor market. Now, there's another type of expenditure in the economy other than consumption, which is called investment. Entrepreneurs, firms who want to expand production capacity need goods and services and spend money on those. That money also goes to the firms. In order to finance those investments, entrepreneurs and firms need resources from somewhere. That money typically comes from households. Households save, and their savings go through what we call the capital market that connects savers with investors, and investment can be realized using the resources saved by the households, or the income, part of the income that is being saved by the households. Let me emphasize the definition of investment here because it's different from the term investment that we use in everyday conversation. If you have some money and buy some stocks, you might say that I invested in the stock market. But that's not the sense in which investment is done here. That act to set aside some of your income and buy some financial instrument, that's called saving. That's this step. Act of investment is act of borrowing or using your own resources, using current resources in order to create production capacity for future production, for future value creation. That's different from saving, and it's also driven by different factors. Just think about the role of interest rate, for example. If interest rate goes up and you're an investor, the cost of investment for you goes up, and therefore you may invest less. But if you're a saver, you're the receiver of the interest rate. the impact on you is going to be very different than the impact on the investor. Now that we've understood these two parts, let's go forward and look at the numbers. Notice here that I'm not introducing the rest of the world or the government and government expenditure or net exports. I just want to focus on consumption versus investment, and I'm going to combine public and private investment and private and public consumption. Here are the numbers for GDP consumption and investment per capita in 2017. In that year, consumption, total private and public, was $49,500, roughly 83% of US GDP, or per capita GDP. Investment was $11,800, total private and public. It was roughly 20% of GDP. And the GDP per capita itself was $59,500, which is 100% of GDP per capita. Notice here that the percentage of consumption and investment add up to more than 100%. That's because we have not taken into account trade deficit. Trade deficit enables the United States to consume and invest more than it produces, and that's roughly 3% of GDP. Let's also take a look at historical figures. Total consumption in the US was about 75% of GDP in the mid-70s. Before that, it used to be somewhat higher, especially during the Great Depression. 95% of GDP was consumption because there was no investment, very little investment at the time. And as the economy grew after World War II, percentage of consumption as a percentage of GDP went down somewhat, but since 1980, there's been a rising trend, to which we're going to come back to see why consumption has grown as share of GDP. Total investment has been roughly around 20% of GDP in the 60s and 70s up to recently. It has been somewhat higher than 20%, but nowadays it hovers around 20%, private and public investment together. During the Great Depression, as I mentioned earlier, there was very little investment. The investment that was done, about 5% of GDP, was essentially replacing some worn-out equipment or maintaining enough investment to just maintain some parts of the capital stock, not a whole lot of new investment. So let me summarize this. Except during major recessions, in the US, investment has been around 20% of GDP, somewhat higher in the 60s and 70s. Since 1980, total consumption has been rising, especially has risen above 80% of GDP in the US. And during recessions, typically the share of investment declines and the share of consumption rises. Now, looking at this graph and thinking about these trends, let me ask you a question. Which one of the factors that I list here below from A to E do you think explains the rise of consumption GDP ratio since the 1980s? Was it government spending that went up? Was it population that has been aging and spending more? Could it be because asset prices went up in the US stock market, house prices go up? Maybe both B and C, or none of the above. Maybe there's been a long-term recession in the US, and that's why the ratio of consumption to GDP has gone up. Now that you've thought about this, let me give you my take on this. My sense is that actually the best answer is D. The aging of population means there are a lot of retired people who are consuming but not producing, and that has increased the share of consumption in total production. Also, stock prices and house prices in the US have risen, and people are feeling richer than they were before, at least people who own stocks or assets. and they spend a lot more as share of their income. They don't save as much because they don't feel that they need a whole lot of saving. Their assets are already taking care of them and provide them with enough wealth for retirement.